I think that we can all be honest and say that the times that we're facing these days are overmatching, are overwhelming in many ways, all the traditional ways which we've showed up as leaders, and that something new is being called forth from us through the Holy Spirit, a different way of exercising power and love, a different way of being in a relationship to authority. And I hope that along with me, you might admit that the place for autocracy, for authoritarianism, that this is actually part of the problem, not the solution. And even though these chaotic times can create anxiety and fear and a kind of impulse to control circumstances, to try to settle things down, in many ways, these attempts to control often inflame and worsen the current circumstances, whether we're talking about the sexual abuse crisis in the church, or the ways in which we're dealing with the environmental crisis, or challenges within our political and social realities. What seems to be called forth now is a different way of leading, and we're very privileged to have Simon to help us reflect on this, as we're being in many ways called to reflect on what has been these different other modes of leadership, which all have their place, their time, their moment. And as discerning leaders, we understand that. But to begin to get a view of this emerging way that leadership is being manifested, and to think about its relationship to ourselves and our roles and our responsibilities, and as we are trying to lead for the Synodal Church. Simon brings to us a very interesting background, which began with a psychiatric nursing experience, where he was very tuned into the interior realities of people struggling, and then began to bring his insights from the psychology of individuals to the work of groups and the psychodynamics in systems and groups, to then beginning to apply these things in his consultation and work, not only with clients, but also informing coaches. Simon, as I mentioned, has a doctoral degree looking at these issues. He has written several books. He's considered a really distinct voice in the field. And if you haven't heard his podcast, Edgy Ideas, I really recommend it. Simon, we're really grateful to have you a part of our DL community, and we're really grateful for your presence here today to give us input and to lead us through reflections and dialogues over the next hour and a half or so. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Simon Western.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Sandra, Pablo, everyone who's organizing. It's nice to see some faces I met in Rome a few months ago. Good to see you all. So let me begin where David left off. My background is I have a very diverse work background, and the books I write are not written from a academic library. They're written from lived experience. So I left school at 16. I worked in a factory. I then became a general nurse, working with the body, realizing how fragile the body could be and also how resilient it could be. So I worked with the dying and the sick. And then I moved into the psychiatric nursing, really trying to understand the difference between sanity and madness, and realizing how thin that line is and how arbitrary it is sometimes, how we can find ourselves falling across that line for different reasons. In the psychiatric asylum, I also really understood for the first time the power of organizations and institutions, how they can shape us, how they can form us. And this wasn't just the patients, this was the psychiatric nurses and the staff. Irving Goffman wrote about total institutions. And since then, I've been very interested in organizations and institutions. I left the psychiatric nursing, and I trained as a family therapist, working with young people in Liverpool, very deprived urban area. And again, it was interesting to think about how we live in a very individualized world. We think about the individual very much. But when you work with young people who are suicidal or anorexic, you realize that you can't really understand their situation without understanding their family situation, without understanding their social situation. So we're all part of social systems, powerful social systems which shape us. I then went to study psychoanalysis and how the unconscious works in teams, in groups, and in organizations. Because in the systems I've been working in with these young people, I realized that there was a lot of unconscious resistances. You know, we knew what we should do to make things better for these young people, and yet we were unable to do them. We got stuck. So I was exploring how teams work well together, how leaders work well, and also how they get stuck. And I became very, very interested in the unconscious dynamics of society. So then I went to university and I really wanted to study leadership, and I did a PhD in leadership. And this is put together with my work experience. It produced a PhD and a book setting out the work I'm going to share with you today. Since that time, I've published books on this work, on eco-leadership and the 4 discourses of leadership, the 4 key approaches of leadership. And I've worked in many, many sectors. So I work in banks in the City of London. I work in hospitals. I work in not-for-profit sector. I've worked in Kosovo and with the United Nations and the Red Cross. I'm recently hired by Ford Motors in the USA. I've been in Detroit. So I'm very privileged. God is very good to me and gives me these gifts to go and see what's going on in all these different sectors. And what's interested me is the commonality between these sectors. They're all struggling with 3 major disruptions: the digital revolution, the technological disruptions in life, the climate change disruptions, and then wider social disruptions because of these other 2 disruptions. Society is changing fast, and we're struggling to keep up with it in the workplaces and in our lives. From a spiritual perspective, my journey has been one of being an agnostic, atheist agnostic, and then I became a Quaker. I got very interested in the contemplative tradition, and also interested in the idea of the priesthood of all believers. So living in the Quaker community is a community which tries to resist the seduction of hierarchy. And it tries to distribute leadership across the whole. I say try because this is an imperfect way of trying, and there is hierarchy. There's informal hierarchy, there's formal hierarchy. So there's no perfect system. Each church has its different shape and form. The Catholic Church has a very particular shape and form, a very interesting one. I've spent many beautiful hours in Catholic churches, and I'm a big fan of the Benedictine monasteries and Camaldolese monasteries. There are places which helped me immensely find myself. And I became very interested in my books. I write about the formation, the spiritual formation, and I use these ideas in the leadership field because I think we can learn so much from monasteries. So that's a bit of my background. I'm going to share with you just some ideas, and then I'm going to ask you to engage in a dialogue and a way of thinking about how these ideas might help us think with Pope Francis about how we co-create a synodal church. I'm very inspired by Pope Francis' work and on synodality in particular. And when I came to Rome, it just interested me even more about the challenges we face in trying to co-create that, because I don't think it's something which is clearly set out, which we can just strive for. I think we have to co-create it and build it together. I think that's what we're being called to do. So I'm going to share some ideas and hope that they resonate with that project and see how we can discuss that and make some sense of it. So I'll share my screen if I can do this.
That's perfect.
That's perfect. Except I'm at the wrong end of the slideshow. Okay, so this talk is about eco-leadership. Eco being the shorthand for ecosystems. Right from the beginning, I wanted to say that the ecosystems I'm describing are not just biological or natural ecosystems. They're ecosystems made up of nature, made up of society, and made up of technology. It's these three things coming together create the world in which we live, and we can't separate ourselves from that. We are part of nature. Technology is part of our lives, as we all sit here on Zoom together, as we can see. And the ecosystems which we co-create with each other, the people, the networks we live in, are kind of part of this. And the three coming together are what interests me. So this slide shows you the 4 discourses of leadership. When I studied leadership for my PhD, my supervisor said, Simon, go away and read leadership for a year. Don't write anything, just absorb leadership. So I read the leadership literature for a year. And during the second year, I started to filter the ideas there. And I came up with this 4 paradigms, 4 approaches of leadership, which have dominated in the last 100 years. I'm not claiming that these 4 are the way leadership's been shaped or practiced. I'm saying that these ideas, I think, can be helpful to us in making sense of leadership. So I'm not claiming any empirical truth about this, but I'm saying that this is what I've noticed in the literature. This is how leadership has shown up. And as I go through my my work, people usually find it quite helpful to think about where leadership is practiced in their workplace, depending on each of these approaches. The other thing to say is that I'm not denigrating these approaches. We need each of these approaches. Each has its own place in any organization, any institution. The question is how we balance these leadership approaches. And to balance them correctly, we need to understand our ecosystems, which means understanding eco-leadership. So let me talk you through the 4 approaches of leadership. So the first approach is the controller leadership discourse. This leadership discourse is very much based on modernity. It's based on science, on rationalism, and the whole idea is based on the notion that we must maximize efficiency. So at the turn of the century, the Industrial Revolution, particularly Ford Motor Cars and writers like Frederick Taylor, they tried to bring science into the workplace to maximize efficiency. They brought reason and rationality. So they brought things like time and motion studies. They tried to create divisions in labor to make it more efficient. And they created the production line. And this was hugely successful at one level. Hugely successful because it enabled us to have mass production. So we were able to make things much, much cheaper, much, much quicker, and it transformed society. from housing to healthcare to car manufacturing, controller leadership really shifted the dial. So it's been a very important discourse and a very important approach, and it's still very important in every organization today. You'll notice this in any organization you work with, that there's questions about targets and audits and efficiencies, how we become more efficient. And of course, this is very important. If you're running a hospital, you want to make sure that you can get patients to have surgery efficiently. And to do that, you need some controller leadership. You need to control your resources. You need to think about how you can make the surgeon and surgery a controlled space to work in. So these ideas are with us and they're powerful. They went into some demise in the mid last century because the weakness of this approach is that it can be dehumanizing. So if you focus on productivity, on efficiency, if you use science, you often miss out on the human part of the organization. So right from the beginning, controller leadership was critiqued for being a dehumanizing approach. So if you're going to use this approach, you need to balance it with other approaches which help on the humanizing the workplace. It went into demise as other approaches became stronger, but it's actually back on the rise again with the new technologies. So with the digital age, we've now got a new approach of leading by numbers. We have a thing called algorithmic management. You get managed through your computers and through your phones. You get measured on your performance. If you work in a service industry, you get people ticking boxes to say and giving you stars. If you're a taxi driver on Uber, you get assessed by your customers. So this control by numbers, this idea of controller leadership is now happening online by algorithms and through target and audit culture. It's very strong in the secular workplaces, hugely strong. Everybody is measured these days. KPIs, your key performance indicators, do you meet them? Do you meet your targets? This is very much part of the discourse today. So controller leadership became weaker because it's dehumanizing, and now it's returning as a very strong discourse. I'm going to give you a chance to answer some questions in a few minutes, and we'll also break out into small groups to discuss this and have a plenary. So any questions, just make a note of them. The second leadership discourse arose in the 1960s, and I call it the therapist leadership discourse. I call it the therapist leadership discourse because it's very much focused on people. There was a big shift in the post-Second World War economy. Workers wanted a better future. Societies wanted to make sure that they were democratic rather than autocratic. They were fearful of what Hitler and what Stalin had done. So in the West, they tried to create a democratic workplace, a bit more democratic. And you had psychology being brought into the workplace. In the 1960s, there's also the countercultural movement in the USA and Europe. And this really put the individual at the center of things. So the individual, questions of freedom, sexual openness, the idea that work was somewhere where you went to labor changed to a place where you went to work on yourself. You went to work to self-actualize, as Maslow said. So there's this whole movement to say, rather than trying to control people, we need to help people be motivated and to be able to self-actualize at work. So there's a big shift. And in the therapist leadership way of thinking, it's very much about soft skills. It's about coaching. It's about psychometrics, about emotional intelligence, about authentic leadership. So it's a very big part of what we see in the workplace today. Very big part in business schools and consultancies, Many of us would fit into this. I'm a coach, so I fit into this kind of discourse, and it became very powerful in the 1960s. It grew to kind of be the major discourse up until about the 1980s. And as I say, still very, very powerful today. You can recognize it all around you. And if you're a coach or a mentor or a spiritual director, you'll be drawing on some of this way of thinking, way of working, way of understanding that to get the best out of people, you have to ensure that they're motivated and they're engaged. So you see this language hugely in the workplace today. In the 1980s in the USA and in Europe, there was a big economic slump. And this therapist leadership discourse wasn't delivering. And the business schools and the workplaces, they looked over their shoulder and they were quite shocked to find that the Asian tiger economies, the Japanese economies and Korean, were overtaking these huge American industries. And it was a shock to the ego, as well as to the economy. And they asked the question, how can Toyota outperform Ford? How can Toshiba outperform the American and European companies? And the answer they came to was that the Asian cultures had collective cultures, and they'd imported these ideas into the workplace. So in the Asian factories, you went to work, you wore the same uniforms. The bosses wore the same uniforms as the workers. They shared the same canteens. There was open space offices. They sang the company song before they started work. And at the workplace, you worked in quality circles. The workers were listened to. How could you make improvements in your part of the work? So they utilize the collective nature of the work of the society to really ensure that every employee could contribute to the success of the company. And that was their aim. And these companies offered workers cradle to grave support. So you had healthcare, you had housing, you had pensions, and you worked for these companies for life. So in America and in the USA and in Europe, the question was, how could we do the same thing? How could we leverage the collective nature of the workplace? And the struggle was that in America and Europe, it was a very individualized society. So we couldn't just draw on this collective nature. So what they came up with was the idea of transformational leadership, which I call the Messiah leadership discourse. And the Messiah leadership discourse is about having a leader or a leadership team who are charismatic, who can offer a vision to which the employees gather around, to which the employees believe in. So you don't come to work just for money. You don't come to work to self-actualize. You come to work because you believe the company is making a difference. So you get people like Steve Jobs is a Messiah leader. He set out a clear idea that Apple was going to change the way we did things in society. They were going to lead this huge change, and to be part of this change was exciting. Workers were very keen to join Apple. They worked long hours. They worked kind of 7 to 8. And in these companies, there's a very strong culture. And in the leadership literature, you started to read about culture. If you look at the charts of the word culture in the workplace, up until about the 1980s, it's very flat. And then suddenly it rises, it shoots up. Everybody wants to engineer the culture of the workplace, to change the culture of the workplace so that the workers can be more engaged and so that they can contribute, so that we could compete with these Asian economies. And that was and that language is still very strong today. So the Messiah leader is necessary. You need a clear vision. You need a strong enough culture in an organization. And yet, if it's too strong, you get a totalizing organizational culture, a bit like I described of when I worked in the mental asylum. And some corporate cultures can be cult-like. And this language is actually used by Peterson, Waterman, and Collins and Porras. They use the idea that to have a cult-like culture is a good thing. Which, of course, to me was a little bit disturbing, because cults don't allow you to question a leader. They stop any questioning. And when they become extreme, these cultures, they can become very problematic. So Enron was a culture, such a culture that everyone believed in the Messiah leaders. Nobody was allowed to question. If you questioned the leadership, you were seen to be disloyal and you were thrown out. And of course, it led to a massive collapse. The final discourse I'm going to talk about is the eco-leadership discourse. And this started to arise in the turn of the 21st century. It's a very different way to think about leadership. It comes from the work of systems thinkers, of complexity thinkers. It starts to recognize that technology is having a massive, and the internet is having a massive impact on society. And people are starting to realize that individual charismatic leaders like Messiah leaders are not able to deliver. You can't deliver from the center anymore. You can't just deliver top down anymore. You have to enable leadership to be spread out throughout the whole organization. You have to have leadership from the edges. And you have to do this because you need to have an organization which can adapt to change very, very quickly. If you're running a business, you really need to understand how quickly customers' preferences change, and you have to change your products very quickly. You have to see how disruptions from the external world can transform your company very, very quickly. So I work in car manufacturing companies, in banks, and they're all feeling very, very fragile. They know that share price can change very, very quickly. Customer preference can churn. So in the banks, they're very, very worried about fintech, about technology, about digital banks taking over from them. You know, these changes are happening very, very quickly. So they need to really try and change the way they work. They need to look at the external ecosystems, what's changing in the external world, and they need to look inside at their own way of working. Since that time, I've written a lot about eco-leadership, and I've tried to develop eco-leadership methodologies in organizations. And at the heart of this, we put ethics. So we try and change the idea of the organization from being a money-making organization or being a very efficient organization to also having a social purpose. And the reason for this is is to really try and understand that one of the big mistakes of the 20th century was that organizations became decoupled, separated from society. They had kind of offshore taxes. They didn't feel they belonged anywhere. They were just there to make money. And actually, of course, organizations are part of society. They're part of the fabric of society. They're part of the economy. And they need to kind of understand how they play that part. And they need to be more ethical and more purpose-driven. Also, a new generation of workers are looking for companies which ask questions about climate change, which have a social purpose. Young people don't want to work in organizations which are just there to make profit and to destroy the planet. So if you want to recruit the best workers and retain the best workers, having a social purpose is also important. The other aspect of eco-leadership is to create a more participative organization. So rather than having a top-down central controlled organization, it's about leading from the edge. It's about everyone having a voice, about being heard. It's about really feeling that you participate in the organization rather than just being a product of it. And the third part of eco-leadership is really to change the way we think about things. So modernity really, and controller leadership, broke things down into component parts. It tried to divide labor. It tried to make us focus on small changes which can make us more efficient. And eco-leadership does the opposite. It looks for connections and interdependencies and patterns so that we can recognize how change takes place in systems. And it's a more complex way. It's a shift from thinking about kind of the organization like an efficient machine to the organization being an ecosystem within other ecosystems. We can't separate ourselves from nature ecosystems. We have to pay attention to climate change in whatever business we run. We have to pay attention to technological changes, whether we work in a hospital or car factory or a bank. These things are really kind of important. So the strengths of eco-leadership are that it does adapt. It offers a new way of thinking for organizations, whatever sector you're in. And I will suggest that it's part of the thinking of synodality. I think this is aligned to that way of thinking. The challenge is that it's very countercultural to how we think about organizations. It's very countercultural to the individualistic leadership ideas we see around us. So in our minds, it's easy to understand controller leadership. We've all seen Messiah leaders, charismatic leaders with visions. We've seen therapist leaders who kind of very good with people, but eco-leadership is harder to conceptualize. It's more challenging for us. And that's one of its challenges. I'm going to stop there and I don't want to overload you with information. I don't know if you want to ask any immediate questions before we break off into groups. Pablo puts into groups. If there's anything immediately on your mind, should I just take a few questions and then we go into groups? Would that be helpful? Way forward. I've downloaded quite a lot of information. I apologize.
No, Simon, it's great to have this this kind of historic overview and the fruits of your research and your thinking. I'm wondering if we could just take a pause for a moment for people to form some questions that they might want to offer, or comments or insights. I would start with one that your description of the Messiah leader is very consistent with my understanding of the way Pope John Paul II took up his authority in the church, and that we saw both the fruits of that and also the fallout of that. The fruits in terms of an incredibly coherent sense of identity in the church, a real clarity of purpose, especially with regards to apparent threats to the church and communism, and then at the same time the downsides of a somewhat coercive understanding of how to tolerate differences and around criticism and diversity. So that's just a comment, and I wonder if that's consistent with your thinking.
Yeah, very, very much so. My wife is Polish, so I spend time in Poland, and definitely John Paul is a Messiah leader. And like you say, there's all these discourses have strengths and challenges. It's not one or the other, you know. So you could see the strength of what John Paul brought to the church. You know, amazing what he did, and particularly for the Polish people and in the communist world, what he did. And the challenges, as you suggested. So yeah, very, very much. That's very helpful.
Ricardo?
Oh, thank you, Simon, for the trip that you gave us. When I was listening to you, one of my questions is the challenge, how to identify the values. And I understand values that guide for action, not only in the personal level, but also in the social level. So the challenge to identify what is the value that are under the context and also in the leadership model. That was one of my thought. The other thing that I was thinking is I was understanding the process, but at the same time, I was making personal questions where I am at. And I found troubles because I understand the idea, but I recognize in myself beliefs, values that are not together with that new process. So I don't want to feel happy that I understand the process. I feel the conflict that I'm not there yet. So just a reflection.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ricardo. The idea of values, I mean, I think the values are there in each of these discourses, and they can be good or bad values. They can go either way. So what I do is I don't try and make this universal or generalize. I say, how do the values show up in your workplace? So we do a deep dive, and we think about how these approaches show up in your workplace, how they show up in you. We have a psychometric questionnaire where we can see the how each of these discourses show up in each of our behaviors and in our thinking. And then we kind of think about what values are needed, what discourses are needed. Do we need some more controller leadership? Do we need some more messiah leadership? Are we lacking a vision? We're often lacking some eco-leadership thinking because that's the newest discourse. So the work is to be done in any given context. And my suggestion is the work needs to be done in our context here.
Thank you.
Paolo, and maybe we'll take one or two more and then move into our small groups.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Simon, since March. Thank you very much for this resume, as David said. And I think it's really important, this new thing that it's bring to the leadership, that is technology. Not only we can say the hardware, the machines, everything's come from the Industrial Revolution, but now with all this kind of technology, but the effects of the internet. Because nowadays leaderships are very, we saw, with United States, with the decision of the Supreme Court and all the kind of polarization that it comes for climate changes, economics, politics, everything. The technology is not just the hardware, not only the software, but the internet and all the effects that this can bring to the individual, the person, and of course to the one or the group who's leading. And this is the issue that the church, even the synod, is touching, that it's the internet effect in our lives. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Well, I agree. I mean, it's a lot of the work I do is do network analysis. One writer said, it's not what computers do for us, it's what they do to us. It's like they become part of us. So in a sense, we all become cyborgs. You know, even we carry things around with us, but we carry this in our minds and how it impacts on us. Of course, there's huge positive gains and possibilities, like we can talk like this across countries, which is fabulous. And there's huge challenges. So, but the question of what the technologies are doing to us as communities is huge. And I think we really have to kind of wake up and try and keep working at that, keep that as central to our way of thinking. And that's part of the eco-leadership way of working. That's like, you know, we really have to kind of hold that in mind because it's so important, and it is changing politics, it's changing society, changes our relationships. You know, if you have children, when I grew up, I used to run on the fields and my mother never knew where I was. It was fine. Now you're tethered to your parents, you know, you're on the phone, you know, you have the phone in your pocket, you're tethered to your parents. So there's not that sense of freedom. It changes how we even relate to our children. So it's huge. So thank you for sharing that. It's an important point.
Thanks, Simon, for touching on that question of relationship, how we're relating to everything, which is kind of at the core of discerning leadership. So Lisa.
Well, I just wanted to share, I don't think you could possibly have hit the nail on the head any better. Right now, I have a 25-year-old son and a 20-year-old daughter, each of whom own 3 companies because they are working in the crypto sphere. And it is global, and it is fast moving, and all the old ideas of leadership that I, thought this is how you should lead your companies. They're like, yeah, that doesn't go anymore, Mom. Nice try. It's changing so incredibly fast out there with the digital world and globalization and the way this generation thinks and the concerns about climate change. My son basically related it to blockchain is now where the internet was in 1996, where nobody had a computer in their hands. And nobody kind of knew, Katie Couric saying, hey, what's the internet? To within 10 years, everybody has a phone that is more powerful than the one that could launch a spaceship or launch the spaceships in '69. So things are changing immensely fast, and it is all around this blockchain technology, globalization, climate, and this generation. And part of it for me is as a leadership coach, am I too old? Can I change the systems thinking? How do I change the systems thinking? And working the spirituality in there to say, okay, God, this is a new era. What's my place in it?
Thank you, Lisa. Very important.
Thanks, Lisa. How about we move now to the questions that you had invited us to consider in small groups. And I wonder also, I would like to just note that, we are a mixed language group. We have members coming from the Spanish-speaking world, the Italian-speaking world, French-speaking world. And so we also welcome non-native English speakers to address the large group. At this moment, I wonder if any of those people on the call would like to offer a comment before we go to the small group, or we could go just to the small group. Anyone? Okay, so Pablo, are we all set and ready for small groups after Simon gives us some questions to consider?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Simon.
So I would ask you just to really try and bring this home into your own experiences, and what discourses, what approaches do you notice in yourself and in the work you do? Just really those two simple questions. What do you notice all four? Which are the strongest? How do they interact with each other? What do you see around you and what do you see in yourself? So just try and make this more practical and think about how these discourses, these leadership approaches show up in yourself and in your work.
Okay, we have time now for people to sound out a little bit in the plenary space about your reflections, your questions, your observations. So how about we use the method of raising your hand and using the digital little tool there, which is at the bottom of your screen, and in the taskbar, you probably know this, to reactions, you can put up your hand. Who would like to offer a comment or question or observation for us? Salve, Romina. Okay, we've had a couple people just join us. Bienvenue, bienvenuto. Okay, anyone would like to offer a comment about Simon's input or things that came up in your conversation? Okay, Bucci.
Hello, David, and hello, everyone. Just to say thanks to Simon for the wonderful models of leadership presented. What resonated in me as an ideal is the eco-leadership paradigm. I just love it, I mentioned in my group that I fell in love with Pope Francis Laudato Si, and because of that, it changed my relationship with environment. I was working in a school, Jesuit school in Lagos, and now I'm in a new school. But while I was in Lagos, I could not make some of those changes I made in the school in terms of change of culture, change of mindset to the environment. Without the therapist model, I still have to kind of use aspects of the therapist model to, to motivate and to kind of, make people see things differently. And even the Messiah model. So I was making a kind of confession that I still had traces of the therapist model, the Messiah model, the efficiency model. For instance, saying that we have to save energy, we have to turn off the lights, turn off the fans when we're not using them. I still had to employ the efficiency model, but the model I'm kind of striving for is the eco leadership model. And I also did not see it as a new model in the 21st century. When I reflected on history, I saw someone like John the 23rd, who kind of convoked the Vatican, the Second Vatican Council. I see him as an eco leader because in that he made the church to think of new ways of doing things and kind of created interconnectivity, deeper interconnectivity. So for him, he was an eco leader. We also have controller leaders, even in the 21st century. In my nation, Nigeria, we have a lot of controller leaders. Ukraine has a controller leader. So I think these spectrums of leaders are kind of also scattered in history. For me as a Jesuit, I see our Ignatian idea of discernment, communal discernment, as very strong in building eco leadership. So kind of carrying people along and consulting people when decisions are being made. So that's just a few reflections for now.
Thanks, Buchi. Simon, do you want to say anything about Buchi's reflection?
Yeah, thank you, Buchi. It's very helpful. And just to say, you shouldn't confess about being a messiah or a therapist or a controller. The whole idea of eco leadership for me is that it doesn't replace the others, but it gets them in the right balance. It's all about balancing these. You won't get to zero carbon unless you have some controller leadership. You do have to have some managerial efficiencies in your workplace. You do have to have a right vision, a purpose. You do need some messiah leadership. You always need great people skills to run a team and to do it well. So it's about getting that balance right and not just having all controller or all messiah. It's about getting the balance right. And to get the balance right takes eco leadership, because you have to think about the ecosystem you're working in and the ecosystems around you. So thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, Simon. Can I just add to that, this idea of really discerning on the basis of our situation, our context, the demands that are being placed upon us, the people we have that are, in our followership or organizations. This question about how we engage the situation, the people, the context, the challenges in a discerning manner and exercise good judgment without making a value judgment about one being better or worse, except relative to the context. I think that's really important. Thanks so much, Buchi and Simon. Others? Srija.
Hello, nice to see you all. I was very happy with our small group sharing and what Simon presented before. Looking at our congregation and looking at many other congregations that I know, we are all on a path towards this systemic change. My observation or comment is, in order to get where we wish to arrive, this eco leadership, we require a different type of spirituality. We need to have a spirituality of networking, collaboration, and also a different skill set to arrive there. So how do we make this happen within our congregation, in the church, in other organizations, especially the faith-based organizations where we are dealing with the canon law, proper law, And depending upon the personal charisma of the leader who is sitting on the top or in the provinces, what's the best way to move forward? So just a question, yes.
Great question. Simon, do you want to take a crack?
It's a great question, Shrija. I love the idea of a spirituality network. In some work I'm doing, I talk about networks of desire, and it's a similar thing. I work in a secular world, so using too much spiritual language is I have to be careful, but it's a similar thing. It's about, I really think we have to think about spirituality in these networks and how that informs our discernment, how that informs our work. I don't think there's a top-down answer. I can't give you an answer, but I think asking the question and seeing where the connections are, seeing where the interdependencies are, seeing how patterns form. There's patterns in the Catholic Church, there's patterns in the Jesuit community, some positive patterns and some not so positive. So thinking systemically is about often seeing what patterns, what repetitions occur in systems, what keeps us trapped in a certain way of being, what opens us up to be more generative and open. And I think spirituality is at the heart of all this. So doing
maybe we can actually address this in a synodal and eco-leadership fashion. So the question that Srija has posed is, what are spiritually rooted practices or ways that we can actually help to foster eco-leadership and a more synodal way of proceeding? What are some of your own experiences or inspirations for how a spirituality of eco-leadership or synodality would look and feel and operate?
One way I'm noticing myself asking this question lately when I'm looking at what's happening in the world, and I'm trying to ask myself, what is God bringing to our attention in the middle of all this? So as we look at the crisis, at the potential, at all what's happening, trying to see how this might be an invitation for us as a team, as an individual, trying, as Simon said, to see the patterns, and in the patterns, try to discern an invitation that is very concrete for us. I don't know if this makes sense as a practice.
Yeah, so in a sense, shifting our way of thinking about spirituality from a personal experience to an interpersonal and collective experience, that seems really essential and foundational. And to ask in a way that's inviting people's distinct experiences to be collected, in the space for all to hear and to understand and to feel. Yeah. How about others?
I would bring some kind of game players. I mean, when I have a very, very difficult team to handle, because they are change reluctant, there are all sorts of things. When you get through the games, as when we were little, when we were children, then people stop to think with their heads, that they go into the game. And then you can experience some very good team building stuff where change can eventually arise. It takes time, but looking at the games, and it's also a very good way to beginning a meeting with explaining people that the new team there that has to experience something new, because they have to put in place a new governance way, or they have to put in place the election of a new team leader or whatsoever. Play and use this example that most of you know already of a fruit salad. Everyone is a fruit, but if one fruit misses, the salad is not the fruit salad it ought to be. So this is a metaphor, but it is very, very helpful, because then you can go with the people, what kind of fruit will you be? Based on your own experience, what are the competencies, the talent that you can bring. And then more than that, what spices would you bring to the fruit salad so that the fruit salad can be better? And so
Okay.
everyone gets to, you know, and it's a metaphor, but it's very, very powerful. I've used that in many teams. It works very, very powerfully, and it brings something very new, and it helps people getting out of the normal way of thinking, because you're kind of tricking them by you come there. What is a fruit salad? They think that she's crazy. What is she talking about? But indeed, then you explain the metaphor. But after, when they have played with the fruit salad, and it works, at least that's my experience.
Merci, Caroline. So you're offering us the idea that a spirituality of eco-leadership could involve different ways of knowing and interacting that are not only rational, but also involve the senses and play and different rules, in a sense, and also the richness of metaphors that lend themselves to thinking in terms of diversity and complementarity. Those feel like really rich contributions. How about others? And Simon, are you finding this interesting?
I am, yeah. Thank you, Caroline. I mean, I do a lot of work with art and with nature, taking people outside of their kind of work context into different contexts as a way of opening up. So it's a different way from Caroline, but it's a similar. I go into art galleries with leaders and I get them to wander the galleries and free associate to the artworks and to the architectures, go into forests, go into different spaces. I'm always taking people into different spaces because it changes the way we feel thinking, and people can start thinking more connectedly, and they connect differently, and they can understand the diversity of connections. You know, if I take a group of people to an art gallery, it's amazing the diversity of what people see and what people become attached to, what people find beautiful, what they turn away from. And people start learning in that way of the diversity and the interconnections between each other and the world around us. So it's very helpful, yeah.
Thanks, Simon. So you mentioned nature. I know that there's several people on this call actually who have a great deal of passion for the way in which we're engaging the importance of care for our common home, and for whom the commitment to sustainability and to Laudato Si and an integral ecology really matters. Does anybody who has that kind of affinity on this call want to say something about the relationship between nature and their understanding of what synodality and spirituality could be about? And I'm thinking a little bit of Ben, for instance, and a few others I know who are very attuned to this particular in really powerful influence and inspiration for us. Ben?
Okay, thank you very much, David, for the invitation. Yeah, I guess I was fortunate, you know, as a young ordained guy within the church to go to Oceania. And having grown up in the hippie generation, and then go to live with people who were still making houses out of, you know, their natural environment and their canoes. They could take everything from nature. And I used to think, you know, the people that I grew up with, they would be in heaven if they arrived. They wouldn't have to be forming hippie communes, because what they were looking for was already there. And I guess, you know, the wisdom of the indigenous people is something that I really came to treasure, and very much a biblical concept of time. The right time is when everybody turns up, you know. So it was a challenge coming out of, you know, a Western chronological time to move into when people are ready time. But and when we look now at the universe, you know, 13.8 billion, we look at the Webb telescope, we look in the microscope, and then putting that in a faith context, the whole thing of the Trinitarian God, the relational God, it's all there in nature. And it's just a matter, I think we're in a new paradigm now to reinterpret the Christian story in the light of the universal story, in a way as a way of evangelizing. I'll just leave it there. But
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks. I mean, it's a significant resource for us at this moment, even if it's crying for our attention. You know, it wants to nourish our imagination for how we are interconnected and need to operate in a different way. We just have to pay attention to the trees, and it's not to romanticize nature, but to really see how powerfully it can teach us. How about any others who want to speak to the spirituality of eco-leadership or of synodality from your own backgrounds, from your own experience? Stefan.
You can mention the charismatic prayer group. I think it's one of the means we can have of today's mean to pray with the charism, to pray the Holy Spirit, and each person in the group may dare receiving and telling to the group what he has received, like a part of the God's message or a part of the God's will. So my practice of this charismatic for many years is a really deep experience of the ecosystem. I think really that's something come to my mind as a very deep experience of that. I mean, the group is listening to the Holy Spirit in a shared, very simple way, no hierarchy. Maybe a leader who can just facilitate the group or reformulate things that are coming, or just noting things. It's a very non-hierarchical experience, and it's a question about daring things, daring to do that. But I mean, it's a very Christian, common, very historical way of doing the ecosystem for my part. Mm.
Merci, this facilitation style.
Yes, also I mean, the charism, the question was about the skills, but also the charism we are all given as a Christian to be part of the system. I think often I can realize that to move to the ecosystem, it's like a shared responsibility to get into this kind of, I mean, the members of a group are doing the eco leader, you know. So, I mean, so we are all responsible of, as a leader, as Christian, to say something or to contribute also. So clericalism is also a responsibility of the member of the group, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think if we feel that as Christian got something to say, or we receive something from God, maybe it's good to have this space or this time to pray together in an open way and to share what we received, in a way to go all together in a direction that is not only one guy direction or one leader direction, but I mean God's direction. Maybe what's one of the best ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Stefan.
Okay. Hope it would make sense what I'm saying.
It does. I know, Ricardo, you have your hand up. I'm wondering if any women or anyone coming from our Spanish-speaking crowd or Italian-speaking crowd would want to contribute, maybe not to this question, but to other things that came up in your small group. And then we want to also switch to kind of some last-minute reflections before we bring the call to an end. But anyone who wants to speak, women, anyone from our Spanish-speaking group, Italian-speaking group? Virginia.
Thank you. I forgot to raise my hand. Just a thought that's coming to me in your invitation is when I think about leadership, often naturally we think of the one holding the position of authority or power. And so we've come to acknowledge the relational aspect through the term followership. And that brings me to the question of discipleship and who we are as disciples, and how how we are with each other as disciples. So I love the question, Sarijit, that you've offered to us. What is in the opening of my day here in Seattle? And I'm just beginning to recognize the opportunity to hold it in the larger context of the followership as well, as much an integral part of leadership. And that brings me to what is often a natural expression of feminine leadership in the collective, and how we sometimes can make no distinction. You know, maybe it's the Quaker model, maybe it's the collective where power is shared and held equally, the empowerment piece. So that's what's coming to me in this, your last call for reflections, David, of the followership piece and the discipleship piece, and who's included, and what voices and cultures and et cetera are not included, and how we make sure we extend the invitation and also think about the impacts on the least privileged.
Okay, so somehow the spirituality of eco-leadership and synodality is very much about changing our understanding of who is on the periphery and how the peripheries and the center are related. And this question of women's roles and women's voices is probably never been more pronounced as an important issue, and it's coming up in the synod process all around the world right now. The call for how women's voices are included in a new way within the church. So yeah, it seems essential. Thank you very much. Estela.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't know if I speak in Spanish or it's better on in English. Spanish is better to me.
Está bien.
Vale, entonces el
Thank
traductor
you.
que cambiar.
Algo de lo que me di cuenta.
Well, I realized while I was listening to Simon
Es la influencia.
is the influence, the social influence, and not only the ecclesial one we're talking about here. In South America, for example, well, I grew up here until I was 18 years old under a military dictatorship. And this had a huge impact on me, at least I feel that. I feel that it really affected me and affected the different leadership styles we have. Not only in Argentina, but also in general throughout South America. And this kind of leadership style, the fact that the strongest were holding the power, well, I realized that this style is still very present in some of our structures, social and ecclesial and congregational structures. It made much sense to me when you talk about eco-leadership. Well, I think it's really meaningful, and I feel that it's helping me to go back to my roots, to my cultural roots as indigenous people, where decisions are being taken within a community, where we are consulting and discerning as a community. Our roots, our Christian roots of the first Christian communities, where there were no hierarchies. Where Leonardo Boff beautifully explained that in the book Charism, Church and Power 40 years ago, censored because of that, talking about the different charisms in the church. And then I think that also in the origin of the Company of Jesus, where we realized that there was this idea of the shared discernment that emerged, and the need to adopt this kind of style that has been built all over the time. So it was a matter of being able to distribute our leadership throughout the vineyard. So when people tell me if the synodal spirit has got nothing to do with my spirituality or the nation spirituality, I say, well, it's got much to do. Well, this is my humble idea. I think it lies in the very origin of that. What has been built in terms of the different styles, the constitution of St. Ignatius, it was so that we would be able to be more agile in our mission. And I'm saying this because this is our legacy as a congregation. And I feel this need to go back to our roots very powerfully, taking on this perspective. It's important to go back and see nature with different eyes and to see us with different eyes. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Estela. We only have about 15 minutes to go. Ricardo, I wanted to come back to you if you had, you still wanted to make a comment, but then I wanted to give closing comments to Simon and then to have some time to wrap up with Sandra. So Ricardo.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Simon, how about your kind of closing reflections?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Estela, I don't speak Spanish, so I missed what you said. Someone will tell me later.
Okay, we had translation available. I'm sorry that we didn't make that more clear.
Okay, I missed it. Apologies. Just to say something about Virginia's point around discipleship and followership, one of the key things I work with is to disrupt this idea that leadership is only about position power. That it's much more fluid than we think. And this is not some idealized projection. If you actually look around you in the workplace or look around you in your communities, you'll see people taking leadership all the time. And yet it's not called leadership. It's particularly not called leadership if a woman does it or someone from a marginal community does it. But you'll see it all the time, people stepping up, taking leadership, and then stepping back. And for me, there's this fluidity between discipleship and followership and leadership. It moves. And I think in the Gospels, you'll find it moving. It moves from Christ to the disciples, to people in the margins, taking positions. So I think we need to recognize that and engage with that. If you look in an organization for leadership just at the top, you'll find it just at the top. If you broaden your view of leadership to understand it as informal as well as formal, as fluid and moving rather than just static, you'll see it everywhere. And the work is, I think, in eco-leadership is to encourage and mobilize that leadership at the margins, at the edges, everywhere, because I believe that each one of us has our own charism and our own capacity to take up leadership in our very own way. And eco-leadership is not about saying it should be done like this or like this. I have a strong therapist leader in me. I have a strong eco-leadership in me. I have a bit of the old Messiah in me. I'm not very good at controller. I need help with that. Keep my accounts in shape. So it's recognizing the leadership within ourselves, within our teams, and really looking in a different way at leadership and really paying attention to these small acts of leadership and encouraging them. So rather than train leaders, the way I think about it is leadership is a formation process, similar to a monastic formation process. It's about creating the spaces for leadership to emerge in any particular context and any particular person or team. I think I'll end there, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So that evokes the image of electricity as a current, going to where it's needed, And yeah, it was very powerful. Simon, as we're coming to an end here on this call, I wonder if you could share with us some of the ways we could follow up with your work.
Yeah, well, there's the, thank you, David. There's the publications. So this is the third edition of the book you showed before, Leadership, a Critical Text. For those of you who are coaches, there's a coaching and mentoring, a critical text. These are available on Amazon. And this is informed by eco-leadership thinking as well. I run a coaching course for advanced coaches, which is bringing coaches away from just the individual focus to the networks and ecosystems. So we're launching a new course in September, so please contact me. I have a podcast called Edgy Ideas. You can find that on any podcast station, and David and I did a lovely podcast. You can go and listen to that amongst many others. I think that's enough for now, but yeah, I have a website called the Eco Leadership Institute. So ecoleadershipinstitute.org. You'll find us, and you'll find all our events, and we have webinars. We have guest speakers. So the next guest speaker is an Indigenous speaker from Australia, talking about the Indigenous ideas around eco-leadership. So that'll be very interesting. So you're all very welcome to join where you can.
Oh, wonderful. It's not the, is it by any chance the author of Sand Talk?
No, it's Michelle. It's a woman, Indigenous woman. She's really brilliant.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, my friends, please join me in thanking Simon, not only for his thought leadership, but his friendship and pioneering work in this area. We are so grateful, Simon.
Thank you.